Let history speak. In the year 323 BC, a colossal shadow loomed over the vast expanse of the known world. Alexander the Great, the man who had carved out an empire stretching from Greece to India, lay on his deathbed in Babylon. His passing was not just the end of a great life. It was the beginning of a maelstrom of chaos that would tear his empire asunder. No one could have predicted the blood-soaked battles, the backstabbing betrayals, and the scramble for power that were about to unfold. The successor wars were about to commence, and the fate of the Alexandrian Empire hung in the balance. The power vacuum, and the first stirrings of conflict. The scene is set in the heart of the empire, as word spreads like wildfire of Alexander's demise. Alexander, a military genius and a visionary leader, had united disparate cultures under his rule, but he had failed to leave a clear successor. His son, Alexander IV, was still an infant, and the generals who had served him loyally now found themselves in a precarious position. These men, known as the Diadochi, were like lions eyeing a fresh kill. Each one of them had their own ambitions, their own ideas of how the empire should be divided, and they were not afraid to use force to get what they wanted. The first to make a move was Perdiccas, the regent appointed to oversee the empire until Alexander IV came of age. Perdiccas was a man of great ambition and power, but he was also a polarizing figure. Some of the other generals saw him as a threat to their own interests, while others were loyal to his vision of maintaining the unity of the empire. Perdiccas, however, soon found himself facing opposition on multiple fronts. One of his first challenges came from Ptolemy, a shrewd and calculating general who had been given control of Egypt. Ptolemy saw Egypt as a rich and strategic prize, and he was determined to keep it for himself. He refused to hand over Alexander's body, which was being transported to Macedonia for burial, and instead diverted it to Egypt. This act was not just a power play. It was a statement of independence and a direct challenge to Perdiccas' authority. Perdiccas was furious. He saw Ptolemy's actions as a betrayal and decided to launch a military campaign against him. In 321 BC, Perdiccas led his army into Egypt, but his campaign was a disaster. His troops faced harsh desert conditions, and his attempts to cross the Nile River were met with fierce resistance from Ptolemy's forces. The soldiers, tired and demoralized, began to question Perdiccas' leadership. A mutiny erupted within his ranks, and Perdiccas was assassinated by his own men. The death of Perdiccas was a turning point in the early stages of the successor wars. It plunged the empire into even greater chaos as the remaining Diadochi saw an opportunity to expand their own territories. Antipater, an old and trusted general, was now in a position of relative power. He had been left in charge of Macedonia while Alexander was on his conquests, and he used his influence to try and maintain some semblance of order. But the other generals were not willing to be controlled. Craterus, another powerful general, had his own plans. He had been away from the heart of the empire during the initial power struggles, but he now returned with an army, hoping to claim his share of the spoils. He allied himself with Antipater, and together they set out to confront the other Diadochi. Their first target was Eumenes, a brilliant strategist who had remained loyal to the idea of a unified empire under Alexander IV. Eumenes was a man of humble origins who had risen through the ranks to become one of Alexander's most trusted lieutenants. He was known for his intelligence and his ability to inspire his troops. Despite being outnumbered and out-resourced, Eumenes managed to hold his own against Craterus and Antipater. In a series of battles, he demonstrated his military prowess, using guerrilla tactics and clever strategies to keep his enemies at bay. One of the most significant battles of this early phase was the Battle of Perdiccas in 320 BC. Eumenes' army faced off against Crateros's forces. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Eumenes managed to gain the upper hand initially, but Craterus, in a desperate attempt to turn the tide, charged into battle and was killed. His death was a major blow to his side, and Eumenes' victory was a significant boost to his morale and his reputation. However, Eumenes' success was short-lived. Antipater, still a powerful force, continued to pursue him. The political landscape was constantly shifting, with alliances being formed and broken at a moment's notice. The other Diadochi, watching from the sidelines, were waiting for the right moment to make their move. And the empire was on the brink of another major upheaval. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the ordinary people of the empire were caught in the middle. Their lives were disrupted by the constant warfare, and the economy was in shambles. Trade routes were cut off, and food shortages became common. The once prosperous cities of the Alexandrian Empire were now filled with refugees, and the social fabric was starting to tear. The successor wars were no longer just a struggle for power among the generals. They were a threat to the very existence of the empire that Alexander had built. The chaos was spreading, and it seemed that there was no end in sight. The stage was set for even more intense and bloody battles in the second part of this saga. The intensifying conflict and the birth of new kingdoms. The second phase of the successor wars was marked by an even greater intensity of conflict. The power vacuum left by Alexander's death had become a breeding ground for ambition and greed, and the Diadochi were more determined than ever to carve out their own kingdoms from the wreckage of the Alexandrian Empire. Antigonus, the One-Eyed, a veteran general who had been biding his time, now emerged as a major player. He had been given control of Phrygia, but he had grander plans. Antigonus was a shrewd and ambitious man, and he saw an opportunity to unify the empire under his rule. He began to expand his territory, absorbing smaller regions and building up his army. His first major target was Eumenes, the last remaining loyalist to the idea of a unified empire. Antigonus saw Eumenes as a threat to his own ambitions, and he launched a relentless campaign against him. The two men, both brilliant military strategists, clashed in a series of battles that would decide the fate of the empire. The Battle of Gabene in 316 BC was a pivotal moment. Antigonus's army faced off against Eumenes' forces. Eumenes' troops were outnumbered, but they fought with great courage. Antigonus, however, had a secret weapon. He managed to capture Eumenes' baggage train, which included the families of many of his soldiers. This act demoralized Eumenes' army, and they began to waver. In a desperate attempt to save his men, Eumenes was betrayed by some of his own officers and was handed over to Antigonus. Antigonus, showing no mercy, had Eumenes executed. With Eumenes out of the way, Antigonus seemed to be on the verge of achieving his goal of unifying the empire. But his success was short-lived. The other Diadochi, seeing Antigonus's growing power, became alarmed. They formed a coalition against him, led by Cassander, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus. The coalition's goal was to stop Antigonus from becoming too powerful and to ensure that the empire remained divided. The resulting war was a long and bloody one, with battles being fought across the length and breadth of the empire. The armies clashed in Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. One of the most significant battles of this phase was the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. Antigonus, now an old man but still full of fight, led his army against the combined forces of the coalition. The battle was a massive confrontation, with thousands of soldiers on both sides. Antigonus's army fought bravely, but they were ultimately outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Antigonus himself was killed in the battle, and his dream of a unified empire died with him. The Battle of Ipsus was a turning point in the Successor Wars. It marked the end of any real hope of reuniting the Alexandrian Empire. Instead, the empire was divided into several smaller kingdoms, each ruled by one of the Diadochi. Ptolemy retained control of Egypt, which became a prosperous and powerful kingdom in its own right. Cassander took over Macedonia, while Lysimachus established his rule in Thrace and Asia Minor. Seleucus, another general, founded the Seleucid Empire, which stretched from Syria to Persia. These new kingdoms were the result of years of bloodshed and political maneuvering. They each had their own unique cultures, governments, and military forces. The Greek influence that Alexander had spread throughout the empire remained, but it was now mixed with local traditions, creating a rich and diverse cultural landscape. However, the peace that followed the Battle of Ipsus was fragile. The new kingdoms were constantly at odds with each other, and there were still power struggles within their own borders. The Successor Wars had left a deep scar on the region, and the people were still suffering from the effects of the long-lasting conflict. In the end, the Alexandrian Empire, once a symbol of unity and power, had been reduced to a collection of smaller kingdoms. The dream of a unified empire that Alexander had envisioned had been shattered. But the legacy of Alexander and the Successor Wars lived on. The Greek language, culture, and ideas continued to spread, and the political landscape of the ancient world had been forever changed. The story of the Alexandrian Empire and the Successor Wars is a cautionary tale about the nature of power and ambition. It shows how a great empire can be torn apart by internal strife and the pursuit of personal gain. It also serves as a reminder of the cost of war, not just in terms of human lives, but also in terms of the destructions of cultures and the disruption of societies. If you like this story, please follow, like, and share it.